country could have been doing if we hadn't imagine what the country could have been doing if we hadn't been embarked upon this xenophobic fever dream since 2016. Imagine the problems that could have been nipped in the bud or avoided altogether. Imagine the energy and effort that could have been put into actual projects designed to improve the status of our nation, whether it was keeping the battery thing up in the north open, or whether it was being better prepared for pandemics, or whether it was actually having supply chains staying unmolested by Brexit so that we wouldn't have actual rationing of actual tomatoes in actual British supermarkets. But on we go. So it wasn't oven ready, right? It didn't get Brexit done, but people like Nadine Dorries and James Duddridge are still offering up their membership of the Boris Johnson fan club. That perhaps is the bit that we're going to talk about. I think today is a delusion day. Today is a day for trying to dismantle the level of delusion that is needed to get a country to where the United Kingdom has been taken. So it's not that long ago that Boris Johnson told this country and told Parliament that the deal was oven ready, until the minute he was handed his ass by his own party and shown the door, he was claiming it as an achievement. He was boasting about having got it done. You now know, even if you were kidding yourself up until this point, you now know that he didn't get it done, that it wasn't oven ready, and that the prospect of the United Kingdom being split, logistically split, so that moving goods to Belfast, if they're destined for Dublin, is categorically different from moving goods to Birmingham. The United Kingdom has been, or will be if this deal gets through, fractured. And it's the only way that you can paper over the much bigger cracks that Brexit has visited upon this country. Again, I find myself wondering what the hell I would be talking to you about if I'd encouraged you to vote for Brexit, or being part of the despicable political media conspiracy to, largely through ignorance, not malevolence, just through stupidity and failure to understand things, that inflicted this fraud, this epic fraud upon an entire nation. I have no clue today. Well, maybe cyclists or something, I don't know. I'd be desperate, but I'm not going to, obviously. How did it happen? If you take today as a day on which it is no longer possible to pretend that Boris Johnson's deal got Brexit done, or indeed that it was oven ready, how do you think that lie went so far, did so much damage? An 80-seat majority in the House of Commons, a Prime Minister utterly ill-equipped to cope with a global pandemic, a regime, an administration that included someone who thought he could look you in the eye and claim that he'd undertaken a 60-mile round trip on his wife's birthday because he needed to test his eyesight before driving back to London, all in direct contravention of the lockdown rules that he had helped to draw up. How did a lie of this magnitude get sold to a country of this quality? How did it happen? How did it happen? I still don't know. 0345 6060 973. And if you fell for the lies, if you thought the deal was oven ready, if you thought Boris Johnson did get Brexit done, I'll put you to the front of the queue today. The front of the queue. Why did you fall for it? What made you believe people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and Nadine Dorries were somehow trustworthy, when people like John Major and Gordon Brown were not? I'd love to know. I'd love to know. 0345 6060 973. We will. What time is the press conference? Do we know? We'll keep an eye on events today. But it is a ribbon-cutting exercise. They're trying to pretend otherwise. But Ursula von der Leyen has no mandate to negotiate. She doesn't have the mandate from the European Commission. All she can do is sign it. So whatever has been agreed has been agreed. There's no last-minute niggling or negotiating. It's all there. And here we are as a country. And Johnson came in when? Middle of 2019. Got Brexit done. It was oven ready. You can no longer pretend that it was. You can lie to yourself. You can get angry with me for pointing this out. You can scream furiously at the reflection in the mirror that I'm holding up. But you can no longer pretend that the deal was oven ready, that it would get Brexit done, or that he'd somehow be able to avoid checks on goods going into Northern Ireland from Great Britain. All of that, categorically untrue, demonstrably false, utterly fraudulent. How did this wonderful, wonderful country fall for such an almighty con job? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. I'm not sure I've ever asked you that question precisely before. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Now that it is, if you bring a scintilla of honesty to the table, and I appreciate that that is far from guaranteed, but a single scintilla of honesty, you can no longer pretend that Boris Johnson's Brexit was anything other than an almighty con job. How did it happen? And as many perspectives as possible, as ever on the programme, especially if you fell for it. Because remember, you'll get no grief from me. No grief from me. My fury is reserved for the people that sold it, not the people that bought it. Contempt for the con men, compassion for the con. But I'm afraid, and it pains me to say this because it's taken me years to fully appreciate it, but it is this profession that has much of the blame, much of the responsibility for this lies with British journalism, what passes for British journalism. Loads and loads of good people, some of my best friends, colleagues, past and present, doing their best. Some absolutely part of the corruption. Some people I've had to share studio space with, absolutely complicit in this. And not just the obvious sort of racist demagogues, but the people insisting that Brexit was going to be a good idea while not understanding anything. It's all there. It just gets handed down from on high. You can't work for the Barclay brothers or Rupert Murdoch or the rest of them without towing a certain line, and you don't waste enough energy. You don't waste any energy at all trying to understand what's right and what's wrong. You just say what you're required to say as loudly as you possibly can. And then you end up in the House of Lords like Charles Moore for being a loud enough advocate of all of the madness that's been inflicted on this country since 2016. And now Johnson's trying to put Paul Dacre in the House of Lords, the man that literally wrote front page headlines designed to denigrate everybody from high court judges to democratically elected politicians. Who elected him? Nobody. In fact, he had a problem with the House of Lords when it was doing its democratic duty and properly scrutinising Brexit-related legislation being handed up from the House of Commons. He was calling it for it to be abolished, I think, around about that time, just like Claire Fox was. And she sits in it now. That's the corruption that we're talking about. That's the denigration of decency, the utter abandonment of values. So you could disagree passionately with somebody 10 years ago. You could even hate some of the stuff that they stood for, some of the stuff that they represented. Think back to austerity, the ludicrous idea that an international global crisis was A, Gordon Brown's fault, and B, something that could be fixed by closing libraries in Wolverhampton. You could have passionate, violent, verbally violent disagreements, but at least you all agreed about the colour of the grass on the pitch you were playing on. You look at some of the stuff. Look at Rory Stewart, right? And the frustration he feels. He's almost traumatized by his experiences in British politics because he is a man who loved playing chess. He played chess since he was a schoolboy, and he then became a professional chess player. He got into the House of Commons. Chess is politics here. And he watched as Boris Johnson started playing chess as if his pawns were queens, as if his knights could move like bishops, as if he could just pick up a piece and plonk it anywhere he wanted on the board and claim not only that that was allowed, but that was a brilliant move, one of the finest moves ever seen, a world-beating move. And what traumatizes people like that is that they look around expecting their colleagues to go, you can't move a pawn 6 spaces diagonally. You can't do that. And he's expecting his colleagues to call it out. He's expecting the British media, he's expecting journalists, columnists, broadcasters to say this is not normal, you simply can't do that. But at the very least, they sat on their hands and said nothing. And at the very worst, they said this man is a chess genius, he's a grandmaster, he's up there with Garry Kasparov. Even Garry Kasparov didn't have the imagination to move a pawn 6 spaces diagonally across the board to knock the Black Queen out of the picture. It's an utter abandonment of basic truth. And that's what's brought us to this. And the people who want Boris Johnson to come back are not ready yet, and possibly never will be, to remove themselves from the teat of dishonesty that he will keep pumping until his dying day. It's 10:49. Just bear with, okay? A bit of stream of consciousness. Well, it's always stream of consciousness. But let me talk to you briefly about where some of the inspiration is coming from. So let's begin with a tweet off a mate, with a message off a mate last night. Just sort of things to think about, things that might make you think. You're probably well aware of this already, mate, but we were just taken off a flight from Porto because the British end was unable to handle a scheduled inbound flight full mainly of Brits from our oldest global ally. The couple next to us with a baby had been trying to get via London to Dubai for 2 days, and then he uses some rather Anglo-Saxon language and wonders whether I'm aware of the extent of the problem because of the job that I do for a living. So you have a little look at flights. Cancellations. BA cancelled 10,000, I think, yesterday at Heathrow in the coming months. Gatwick yesterday announced that everything's going to be getting back to normal, and 10 minutes later announced the cancellation, I think, of 26 flights because so many air traffic control people were off sick. So staff shortages continue to impact upon that sector. Then you've got the front page of the City AM newspaper, which is, I mean, it literally describes itself on the masthead as London's business newspaper. It's quite good these days. It used to be an absolute skipfire. I forget the name of the bloke that used to edit it, but he was a hardcore Brexiter. Imagine being a financial journalist and being pro-Brexit. It speaks of an ignorance on a level that would probably get you a job in the cabinet. So the front page of City AM today is bad news. This is it. They've just put bad news in 4-inch high big black letters. Bad news, pages 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and 11. And then good news, Crossrail to fully open in November, which is relatively good news if you're a commuter working in London. That's not a joke. That is it. I think they may have nicked the idea off us. I don't know if you remember last week, we announced that we were going to start the programme every day with some good news. And by the second day of the scheme, of the plan, we couldn't find any. So we had to drop the feature even before it had begun. But that's City AM, London's business newspaper. Bad news, pages 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Good news, Crossrail 2 fully open in November. And then, because I work very hard on your behalf, as we have discussed recently, putting in proper sort of coal miner style shifts for you on a daily basis, I also consult, when I can, some foreign media. In fact, I get sent links to relevant stories by my brilliant listeners and some of my now in excess of 1 million Twitter followers. So this is from France's, I think it's a newspaper of record, Le Monde. I don't know whether this is relevant, but it all seems to me to speak to a similar theme. You go to the editorial of Le Monde published just yesterday, and there's a link. You can just press read in English. Did you know that? To read the editorials of one of the best-selling newspapers in France, just press a button, you can read it all in English. I shouldn't have told you that, should I? I should have pretended I was translating it on site from the original. So the headline is, the UK's downturn is a warning for Europe. The focus on ideology over pragmatism in response to the worst crisis in the country since the 1970s risks aggravating the deteriorating situation left by Boris Johnson and feeding the temptation to deploy anti-European and nationalist rhetoric. I'll read you a little bit more, actually, because, God won't, I get it wrong every day. God grant, no, won't the gifty gears to see ourselves as others see us, as the great Scottish bard almost wrote. In the absence of economic shock buffers, the United Kingdom's population is often more affected by financial crises than elsewhere on the European continent. And I guess the economic shock buffers that we lack are consequences probably of 12 years of Tory rule and the tyranny of these ludicrous self-styled think tanks that refuse to tell us who funds them, but pop up all over the telly all the time, telling us that we should be doing even more to help businesses make even more money, while not introducing things like a £15 an hour minimum wage. Anyway, the economic and social storm that is brewing across the Channel confirms this observation. That phrase there, just look at it. The economic and social storm that is brewing across the Channel confirms this observation. The British are enduring the worst price increases of the G7 countries. The cost of food is soaring, while the cost of energy will have almost tripled in 1 year. Add in the damage of Brexit and COVID-19, and the UK threatens to regress to looking like an emerging market, said the Danish bank Saxo. The leaders of the National Health Service have even come out of their shells to warn about the risk of a humanitarian crisis linked to the impoverishment of the population.
I've been in finance since 1980.
I do like investments.
I invest in businesses quite a lot.
We first considered investing in gold when we were still very concerned about the global economy, Europe in particular.
I mean, clearly we're living in a time of unprecedented uncertainty.
There it is. French newspaper reporting on this country, and probably paying more attention to what the Danish bank has said about our economy and what the